In what is being called the most consequential corporate delegation in post-war American history, 17 of the most powerful executives on Earth boarded Air Force One and flew to Beijing, not for a trade conference, not for a diplomatic courtesy call, to negotiate. Beijing Capital International Airport, 5 in the morning, the tarmac still wet from overnight rain. No crowds, no banners, just a motorcade of black vehicles stretching into the pre-dawn darkness, headlights cutting through the mist like a slow procession. And at the front of that procession, the President of the United States. Look at who was on that plane. Kelly Ortberg, Boeing, the company that builds the backbone of American air power. Kelly Frink, Cargill, the invisible hand that feeds a nation. Larry Fink, BlackRock, the firm that manages more money than the GDP of every country on Earth except 2. Tim Cook, Apple, 80% of whose iPhones are assembled in the country he just landed in. Elon Musk, Tesla. SpaceX, the man whose Shanghai factory is his largest export hub on the planet. 17 names, 17 empires, and every single one of them needed something from the man waiting across the table. This is the image that mainstream coverage reduced to a handshake photograph and a headline about trade normalization. But if you know how to read a delegation, not the speeches, not the press releases, but the names on the manifest, you understand immediately that something structural is happening here, something that cannot be undone by the next summit or the next election cycle. In 26, May 13 to be precise, the United States arrived in Beijing carrying not a position of strength, but a list of problems that only one country on Earth could solve. Boeing needed orders to keep its defense production lines alive. Apple needed supply chain security. Cargill needed market access. BlackRock needed regulatory relief. China had answers to all of it. The question that no anchor asked and no press release answered, is this. When you understand why Xi Jinping never announced a single number, never signed a single document, and never corrected a single claim that Donald Trump made on live television that night, you will understand who actually controlled this summit. And it was not the man who flew 17 hours to get there. There is a rule in geopolitics that the mainstream press almost never states plainly. The side that needs a headline is always the weaker side. In the spring of 2026, Donald Trump needed a headline. Not because of tariffs, not because of ideology, because November was coming. Midterm elections, a Republican majority that required proof, visible, televised, undeniable proof that the trade war had produced something other than inflation and disrupted supply chains. He needed a win he could hold up on camera. Xi Jinping needed nothing of the sort. Think about that asymmetry for a moment. One leader arrived in Beijing having spent the previous 18 months imposing tariffs that cut bilateral trade in goods by 29%. A self-inflicted wound that his own Commerce Department had documented. One leader arrived carrying the weight of an ongoing war in Iran that had shuttered the world's most critical oil corridor and handed American taxpayers a $40 billion insurance liability they never voted for. One leader arrived needing the meeting to succeed. The other leader simply agreed to host it. This is not analysis. This is the structural reality that the composition of the delegation confirms without ambiguity. When a country sends its president alongside the CEOs of its most strategically vulnerable companies, aviation, finance, agriculture, semiconductors, it is not projecting strength. It is presenting a menu of needs and hoping the host will order generously. Not because China was militarily superior on that day, not because American tariffs had failed entirely, but because one side had spent 9 years allowing the other side to accumulate leverage, order by order, contract by contract, rare earth shipment by rare earth shipment, and now sat across a banquet table in the Great Hall of the People, hoping to renegotiate terms it no longer controlled. Xi Jinping hosted a state banquet. He gave a toast. He called Trump his friend and spoke warmly about the future of bilateral relations. He announced nothing. Trump left the banquet, climbed into his motorcade, and within the hour was on Fox News telling Sean Hannity that China had agreed to buy 200 Boeing jets. Xi had said nothing of the kind. That gap between what one man declared and what the other man confirmed is not a communication error. That gap is the entire story. To understand why this summit happened the way it did, You need to go back 9 years. 2017, Trump's first visit to Beijing. Xi Jinping, playing the gracious host even then, presided over what was announced as one of the largest commercial aviation deals in history. China ordered 300 Boeing aircraft. The deal was valued at $37 billion. Trump declared victory. The cameras rolled. The handshakes landed on every front page. Then China went quiet. For 9 consecutive years, Beijing placed no major commercial aircraft order with Boeing. 9 years. While Airbus, the European rival that Washington has spent decades accusing of receiving unfair state subsidies, accumulated Chinese orders worth roughly $55 billion at list prices since 2025 alone. $55 billion that did not go to factories in Renton, Washington. That did not go to the production lines that also build the KC-46 tanker, the aircraft that refuels every fighter and bomber the United States Air Force operates. Both sides understood the leverage embedded in that silence. Both sides understood that a Boeing order was not merely a commercial transaction. It was a lifeline with a kill switch attached. Here is what that silence actually cost. Boeing's defense division posted a negative operating margin for all of 2025. Negative. The company that manufactures the backbone of American air power, the tankers, the maritime patrol aircraft, the next generation Air Force One, lost money doing it. The KC-46 Pegasus program alone hemorrhaged over $8 billion on a fixed-price contract originally valued at $4.9 billion. The T-7 Red Hawk trainer shed hundreds of millions more. The VC-25B, the presidential aircraft that Trump himself will eventually fly on, is $4 billion over budget and still behind schedule. The commercial and defense sides of Boeing are not separate businesses. They share engineering workforces, production infrastructure, and institutional knowledge. When commercial orders disappear, the entire organism weakens. When the organism weakens, the Pentagon's supply chain weakens with it. China understood this chain precisely. Meanwhile, in the weeks leading up to the Beijing summit, analysts at Jefferies estimated that a Chinese aircraft order could reach 500 planes. Bloomberg reported that negotiations included roughly 100 wide-body aircraft, 787s and 777s, in addition to hundreds of the best-selling 737 MAX, 500 aircraft, tens of billions of dollars, a potential resuscitation of the most strategically important manufacturer in the American industrial base. Both sides knew Boeing desperately needed those orders. Both sides knew China did not desperately need Boeing. Not yet, not while the domestically produced C-919 was entering service and the C-929 wide-body remained in development. The negotiation was never between equals. It was between a seller who could not afford to walk away and a buyer who could afford to wait indefinitely. 9 years of waiting had already proven that. May 14th, 2026, the Great Hall of the People, Beijing. The state banquet begins at 7 in the evening local time. 1,200 seats. Crystal glassware, an orchestra performing in a hall the size of an aircraft hangar. Xi Jinping raises his glass and speaks warmly about the long arc of Chinese-American relations. Trump responds, calls Xi his friend, and says, on the record, in front of cameras, that the two countries are going to have a fantastic future together. The room applauds. 17 American CEOs sit at their assigned places and smile. Nothing is signed. Observe what Xi does during this dinner. He speaks in generalities. He talks about frameworks. He talks about stability and mutual respect and the importance of dialogue. He does not mention aircraft. He does not mention quantities. He does not mention timelines. Every word he says is technically true, diplomatically impeccable, and strategically non-committal. He is not avoiding the subject. He is controlling it. Now observe what happens next. The dinner concludes. Trump moves toward his motorcade. Somewhere between the Great Hall and his next destination, a decision is made, and not by a communications director, not by a policy advisor, but by the instinct of a man who has built his entire political identity around the art of the visible win. He calls Fox News, Sean Hannity, live television. And in that interview, Donald Trump, the President of the United States, speaking without a prepared statement, without a signed agreement, without independent verification of any kind, announces the following. His exact words, as reported by Fox Business on May 14th, 2026. One thing he agreed to today, he's going to order 200 jets. That's a big thing. Boeing, 200 big ones. That's a lot of jobs. It's a lot. Boeing wanted 150. He got 200. Boeing issued no confirmation. The White House issued no formal statement. Bloomberg reported the following morning that whatever accord had been reached remained, and this is their precise language, nebulous, on numbers, on aircraft type, and on timing. The market read the silence. Boeing shares closed 4.73% lower that same session. Not because the deal was bad, because the market could not confirm the deal existed in the form Trump had described it. Xi Jinping, at that same moment, was sleeping in Zhongnanhai. He had announced nothing. He had promised nothing. He had committed nothing to paper. And the American president had done all of his announcing for him. Stay. Because what she said or didn't say the next morning changes the entire calculus. No number, no signature, no timeline. Those three absences are not an oversight. They are not a product of diplomatic protocol or translation delay or the compressed schedule of a two-day summit. They are the architecture of a strategy that China has refined over decades and deployed with surgical precision at the exact moment American vulnerability was at its peak. This is the reveal. Xi Jinping never announced a single figure because he did not need to. The moment Trump walked out of that banquet and declared 200 jets on live television, Xi had achieved something far more valuable than a signed contract. He had made the President of the United States his press secretary. On the surface, Xi's silence means this: no formal commitment, no legal obligation, complete deniability. If the deal materializes, China receives the aircraft it needs to expand its aviation capacity. If the deal collapses, China absorbs no reputational damage, no market penalty, no diplomatic cost. The ambiguity is not a byproduct of the negotiation. The ambiguity is the negotiation. Beneath the surface, Xi's silence means something far more structurally significant. Trump set the number. Trump made the announcement. Trump built the expectation in the minds of Boeing shareholders, Boeing workers, Boeing creditors, and the American public, which means that if the order is downgraded, delayed, or quietly abandoned in the months ahead, the collapse of that expectation belongs entirely to Washington, not Beijing. China purchased control of the narrative without spending a single dollar. Now examine the economic architecture underneath this moment. Boeing requires a sustained production rate on its commercial aircraft lines to justify the fixed infrastructure costs of its military programs. The KC-46 tanker is derived from the commercial 767. The P-8 Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft, the Navy's primary tool for tracking Chinese submarines in the Pacific, is a modified 737. The engineering workforce, the tooling, the institutional expertise, they flow between the commercial and defense divisions like blood through a single circulatory system. When commercial orders are absent, production rates fall. When production rates fall, per unit costs on military contracts rise. When per unit costs rise, programs bleed. And Boeing's programs are already hemorrhaging at a scale that has prompted discussion in congressional defense committees about emergency intervention authorities under Title 10 of the United States Code. The Chinese order, whether it arrives at 200 aircraft, as Trump declared, or 500, as analysts anticipated, or some negotiated figure in between, is not a commercial transaction. It is a pressure valve that Beijing controls. Open it, and Boeing stabilizes. Close it, and Boeing deteriorates. The Pentagon deteriorates with it. Consider the legal dimension. Without a signed framework agreement, without a memorandum of understanding, without even a letter of intent entered into the public record, there is no instrument under international commercial law that binds any Chinese airline to any purchase commitment. Trump's televised declaration has no legal standing in any jurisdiction. It is, in the precise language of contract law, an expression of intent communicated unilaterally by a third party with no documented authority to speak on behalf of the buyer. Xi did not just avoid commitment. He constructed a situation in which the American president voluntarily assumed all of the communicative risk while China retained all of the optionality. This is what controlled ambiguity looks like at the highest level of geopolitical competition. And here is the detail that every analysis published in the 72 hours following the summit missed entirely. The morning after Trump's Fox News interview, the official Xinhua news agency published its summary of the Beijing summit. It described a framework for bilateral stability. It mentioned agricultural cooperation. It noted agreements on energy purchases. It did not mention Boeing, not once. Two governments, one summit, two entirely different announcements. Only one of them mentioned 200 aircraft. It was not Beijing. His name is not important. What matters is that he has worked the 737 MAX assembly line in Renton, Washington for 22 years. He watched the Fox News interview on his phone during his lunch break. For approximately 4 minutes, he believed the crisis was over. 200 aircraft, hundreds of jobs, the production rate that management had been quietly warning might need adjustment, stabilized, at least for another cycle. He texted his wife. She texted back a single word: finally. Then the market closed. Boeing down 4.73%. He searched for the Boeing press release confirming the order. There was none. He searched for the White House statement. There was none. He found a Bloomberg headline that used the word nebulous and had to look it up. It means unclear, uncertain, without definite form. He put his phone in his pocket and went back to work. 2,000 miles east, in a county in Iowa where the margin between a profitable harvest and a devastating one is measured in cents per bushel, a grain cooperative manager had been tracking the Beijing summit with equal intensity. Agricultural purchases were mentioned in the White House summary of outcomes. Mentioned without quantities, without timelines, without the specific commodity commitments that actually move markets. Soy futures barely responded. He had heard this before. 2017. The announcement, the optimism, the years of silence that followed. He did not text anyone. Now watch what happens on the public stage during these same 48 hours. Trump, back in Washington, doubles down. He tells reporters the China deal is tremendous. He says American companies are going to make a fortune. He says Xi is a brilliant man who understands economics. Each claim lands without a corresponding document, without an independent source, without a number that any analyst can enter into a model and stress test against reality. The claims are not lies in the conventional sense. They are declarations made in the absence of verification, which in financial markets, in contract law, and in the architecture of international trade is a category of statement that carries its own specific and measurable risk. Meanwhile, Xinhua publishes nothing about Boeing on day 2. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce releases a statement about the importance of stable trade relations and the mutual benefits of economic cooperation. General language, institutional language, the language of a government that has made no specific commitment and intends to preserve that condition for as long as strategically useful. Xi Jinping gives no interviews, holds no press conference, issues no correction and no confirmation. His silence is not absence, it is posture. And in the gap between Trump's declarations and Beijing's institutional quiet, two ordinary men, one in Renton, one in Iowa, are left trying to determine whether the news they watched actually changed anything at all. Who controlled this summit? The man who announced the deal or the man who never confirmed it? Drop your answer below. 2 hours after Trump's Fox News interview, the first institutional question arrives. Not from a foreign government. From a financial analyst at Jefferies who had modeled the Boeing scenario at 500 aircraft and now needed to reconcile that figure against the 200 Trump had declared on live television. The discrepancy was not a rounding error. It was a 300 aircraft gap representing tens of billions of dollars in revenue, thousands of production hours, and the difference between a Boeing that stabilizes and a Boeing that continues to deteriorate. He revised his model downward and said nothing publicly until markets opened. 24 hours after the summit concludes, Boeing shares close 4.73% lower. The market has read the ambiguity and priced it accordingly. Not the deal itself, the uncertainty surrounding the deal. In quantitative trading systems, unverified executive declarations from a sitting president carry a specific risk coefficient. Algorithms do not weight presidential enthusiasm. They weight signed agreements, delivery schedules, and counterparty confirmation. There was none of the above. 48 hours out, A senior member of the Senate Armed Services Committee submits a formal inquiry to the Department of Defense requesting clarification on whether any aircraft commitments obtained during the Beijing summit carry legally binding status under existing export control frameworks and foreign military sales regulations. The Pentagon responds that it is reviewing the outcomes of the summit. That response is itself an answer. 1 week later, the ripple reaches Europe. In Brussels, trade policy officials who had spent the previous 18 months watching Washington impose unilateral tariffs on allies now add a new data point to their strategic calculus. If the United States government can announce a $50 billion commercial outcome that its own market immediately discounts, and if the counterparty government can allow that announcement to stand uncorrected, then the architecture of American negotiating credibility requires reassessment. They do not say this publicly. They do not need to. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney had already said it plainly in January of 2026, and his words carry more weight now than they did then. His precise statement, "China has been more predictable than the United States in recent months." That sentence, spoken by the leader of America's largest trading partner and closest geographic neighbor, is not diplomacy. It is a verdict. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz remains functionally closed to American-flagged vessels. The $40 billion government reinsurance facility established by the Development Finance Corporation has not restored shipping confidence. Tanker crews do not read policy frameworks, they read threat assessments. The summit produced no breakthrough on Iran, no breakthrough on rare earth export controls, no breakthrough on semiconductor restrictions. What it produced was a photograph, a state banquet, and a presidential declaration on Fox News that Beijing never confirmed and never needed to deny. The ripple does not crash. It does not announce itself. It simply spreads. Boardroom to trading floor to allied capital to the slow, grinding recalculation of who in this new order can be relied upon to mean what they say. Here is what happened in Beijing. $50 billion in potential transactions discussed across 2 days of meetings, 0 documents signed, 0 figures confirmed by the Chinese government, 0 binding commitments entered into any legal framework recognized by international commercial law, 9 years of silence from Beijing on Boeing orders. And when Beijing finally allowed the subject to surface, it let Washington do the announcing. 17 chief executives, the aviation backbone of American national defense, the financial infrastructure of the American economy, the agricultural supply chain that feeds export markets, all of them in the same room with one government that needed outcomes and one government that needed nothing urgently enough to say so in writing. Negative 4.73%. Boeing's market response to its own good news. The number that tells you everything the press conference did not. This is not the story of a bad deal. It is the story of something more durable and more consequential than any single transaction. It is the story of who controls the terms of the conversation. Trump flew 17 hours to announce China's decisions for them. Xi Jinping stayed home and said nothing. America didn't lose its seat at the table. It just stopped being the one who sets it. You are watching 24-Hour Movement. Subscribe, because the next chapter of this story is already being written in Beijing.